Hi there, I'm Wendy McCallum, burnout and balance coach and wellness expert, and you're listening to Bite Size Balance, where everyday extraordinary women share their stories, expertise, and wisdom, all in the name of lifting each other up and creating a better life by design. Whether it's wellness, career, relationships, food, mindfulness, hormones, or parenting, we talk about all things women's balance. If your life looks great on paper, but it still feels like something's missing, you're in the right place. Welcome to Bite Size Balance. Hello, everybody. I'm back with my favorite guest. Dr. Sarah Baillie is here, and today we are going to start talking about burnout and adrenal fatigue. So welcome back, Sarah.
Hi, glad to be here.
I feel like we have an awful lot to talk about on this topic. This is something that you specialize in as a naturopathic doctor, and this is something that I specialize in as a coach. So we're both really passionate about helping women really identify when they are getting close to burnout, in burnout, and really doing what we can to support them in that phase, getting out of it. You've got your take on it, which is really based on more the physiological side of it, and my take is more based on kind of the lifestyle practices side of it. So I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation, and I have so many questions for you. My first question is, are adrenal fatigue and burnout the same thing?
Yes, they are the same thing. If you look at the World Health Organization definition of burnout, it applies only to workplace burnout. So the three categories that they talk about or three symptoms that they talk about in burnout in terms of workplace is exhaustion, alienation from like work-related activities, and reduced performance. So it's considered sort of an occupational phenomenon in its official definition. But I think that sort of doesn't take into account the work of life, right? It takes into account only specific working outside of the home situations, and it doesn't take into account, the work of caregiving and the work of looking after your house and the work of looking after children and caregiving parents and that sort of thing. The things that cause us to burn out in the rest of our life as well. So it's multifaceted in my world, and adrenal fatigue, for me, is the sort of clinical expression of that, if you will. There really isn't a clinical expression or clinical definition of burnout. There's not a lot of research on it. It's just these three categories that they look at. For me, adrenal fatigue is much more holistic. It looks at the whole person, and it's basically sort of a collection of symptoms that reflect suboptimal health, and that it can be you can develop adrenal fatigue from many different causes, so not just workplace stress.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a really important point, and that's certainly the way I look at burnout. And my clients that I work with are, generally speaking, as you know, they're busy professional women, largely mothers. So they're people who have gotten to a place of near burnout or burnout as a result of caregiving. So caregiving stress, and just generally, like I call it, just giving stress. So where they're just giving. So they've been building a career maybe for the last 20 years, giving everything to that. They've been giving everything to their family, keeping a home, doing all of the other stuff. So the World Health Organization definition is helpful if you're talking about, if you're in the corporate wellness context and you're specifically talking about employment burnout. But burnout in my experience, and I think again in your experience and opinion, encompasses a much broader set of causes than just workplace burnout. And I also think that the definition from the World Health Organization in terms of those three symptoms that we tend to see, that's also a pretty narrow definition. So for example, on my website, there's a free burnout quiz that you can do that it's not in any way like a diagnosing tool, but it's just a tool that will kind of help you see, like, do I have these symptoms? And there's so many other things on there besides the three that you just listed. One of the things that's really common that I just see this clinically and with the women that I work with is that people will say this to me all the time. I don't know if you've heard this in your office, but something like, I used to be this really positive person, but it's like suddenly the glass is half empty and I can't figure out how to fill it back up. I just feel kind of, I've got this pessimistic attitude. I just don't have the same, kind of joie de vivre that I had when I was younger. And And that's a really common, when I hear that, I immediately start to think, okay, this person, there's possible burnout happening here. Is that something that you hear too?
Oh, yeah, definitely. That and lack of motivation. So lack of joy for the things that used to bring you joy, um, not feeling energized by the things that used to energize. For example, a lot of people who are in adrenal fatigue will start avoiding social situations. Largely, I think because the body is saying, "No, please rest. Just rest. I can't actually give any more to a social situation." And that's where often, we can talk about this later, it mimics depression in some way. Some women wonder if they're actually depressed because they don't feel like going out and doing things, even with their besties, even with the people that have supported them mostly and tend to give them energy. It just feels like too much. And I think that's the body actually saying, we don't have the resources for this. Can you please just stay home and look after yourself?
Right.
But it looks like for people who are unused to feeling this way, it looks like depression.
Yeah. Yeah. The
Right?
other thing that I see all the time, and again, I don't know if this is common for you as well, but of course, a big piece of my practice is helping women make change in relation to less healthy coping mechanisms that they become overly reliant on. And I see that so often in conjunction with burnout. So, and that's certainly a piece of my story around alcohol, is that I burnt out in my previous career. I left that and started doing what I do now. But a big piece of my increased reliance on alcohol was just me trying to escape and cope.
Yeah.
And it's such a common thing in burnout, whether it's alcohol or it's food or it's social media or it's online shopping or it's gambling or it's whatever. I see that as I'm putting this in air quotes, but like a symptom of burnout very often.
Hmm.
Yeah. So can you talk about, I think there are going to be lots of people listening who don't know what the adrenals are. So maybe you can just start by explaining what your adrenal glands are and what they do.
Okay, they're like little hats that sit on top of your kidneys. They look
Okay.
like little dunce caps, if you will. Like, they're kind of pointy and they sit right on top of your kidneys. So you would feel them kind of in the low back area. Um, and they do a lot of things. In adrenal fatigue, we tend to focus mostly on their production of adrenaline and cortisol and like stress hormones, basically. They also provide precursor hormones to female reproductive hormones and male reproductive hormones. And one part of them regulates your water balance. So how much water you keep in your body versus how much you pee out.
Huh.
Oh,
I
And
did.
and they and yeah, so I mean, they help in producing all these things. They help regulate blood sugar and blood pressure and inflammation and cardiovascular health and all of those things. So they're pretty important for two small, very small little organs.
Yeah. Okay. That's really helpful. I actually didn't, well, first of all, I was not picturing them as dunce caps on my kidneys. So that's now,
Well,
that image is now burned in my brain forever.
I know. It's just that they're kind of pointy. So I don't know where that came from. Yeah. I mean, they're much smarter than one would associate with dunce caps. So perhaps we need a more positive,
Yeah.
like
Wizard
like a
caps.
toque, like a pointy winter happy toque.
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah, so that's it's helpful to know where they are. It's also really helpful, I think, for people to know that they do more than just manage stress, because I think that's it certainly was kind of my preconceived notion as to what the adrenals do. Is I always focus on adrenals in relation to stress, but they're complicated and they do all kinds of different things. So what I want to ask you about, you and I had a conversation before we started recording this podcast, and one of the things we were talking about was, why people end up in your office as a naturopath in relation to burnout, and the difference between kind of the conventional medical approach to this. Again, we're going to generalize on this podcast, but generally speaking, there's a different approach that gets taken in the conventional medical system versus the naturopathic route.
Right. So I will often see people who on their intake form it says fatigue, exhaustion, and then a list of sort of multiple symptoms that they may not think as related to that symptom in particular. And usually the route that they've gone is to first, when they recognize that they're not feeling well, go and have some blood tests done. Go to their family doctor, have some blood tests done. Generally, if there's fatigue, your doctor's going to check you for diabetes, thyroid disease, low B12. Hopefully they'll check for, if they're not checking for B12, they need to. So that's something to ask your doctor for. Iron status, ferritin, iron storage. Those tests, when they come back normal or within range that the family physicians are happy with, then the people are often sent away with the prescription to exercise more, right? Get off the couch, which in some cases, very valid. In other cases, the women who are going to ask for these tests are actually over exercising because they're trying to increase their energy, or they're trying to lose weight that have come on with menopause or with burnout. So often these women are fit and they are doing all the right things. Their diets are pretty good by conventional standards, and yet all their tests come back normal, and they don't understand why they have lost their joie de vivre, and they can't get out of their own way, and they're anxious and tired and all of the the huge list of symptoms that comes with that. So then often what happens before they end up in my office is that they go off, they're told to exercise more, and if they're already exercising, then they might be given an antidepressant, might be given a sleeping pill if they're not sleeping well. And then if that all fails, then they, if they're lucky, they might get 3 weeks off of work, right? Oh, it must be stress to do with work. Now, sometimes there are related factors that definitely mean that women are sort of have more stressors. So for example, they may need time off of work because they're also handling a sick parent at home, or that kind of thing. But just in the general population, this is kind of what happens. And then they end up in our offices, right? So then they come and they say, right, so I've done all these things, here's my blood work, here's my exercise routine, here's my diet, what is happening? I don't understand what's happening. So, I mean, that's a pretty typical presentation in my office.
And if someone's listening to this podcast and they're thinking to themselves, wow, that sounds like me. We're not here to give any medical advice, obviously, or do any diagnosing. That's not what's happening here. But there are some places that you can start just to get some more information about this. I know, as I said, there's a free burnout quiz on my website on the burnout coaching page that you can download and take, which is really just kind of a checklist for some of the common symptoms that I see clinically in my coaching practice. They're not medical symptoms. And then I know that you have a resource too that you point people to. Do you want to share that?
Yeah, so there's James Wilson, who's a chiropractor and a PhD, was the first person to name adrenal fatigue, as far as we know. He wrote a book called Adrenal Fatigue, 21st Century Stress Syndrome. It might be 20 years old. I can't, it's so dog-eared in my office that it looks like it's 20 years old. Anyways, his website has a very detailed questionnaire, and you can kind of check where you fit. And, all questionnaires with computer tallying don't tell you the whole story, but it can give you an idea. It can give you an idea of what are the things that get people to the point where they're adrenally fatigued, and you can sort of see where it fits in your life.
Yeah. And that, it's just a good starting point for people. We obviously recommending that you go and talk to your naturopath about this, or your doctor, if you feel that you're there, but it's a great place, I think, to start. Just kind of give you a sense of like what some of those common things are that you see, for example, in your office around this. Okay. I want to talk about, because we're all about giving people hope on this podcast, you and me. Things I want to talk about. I want to talk a little bit about, like how I want to talk about how people get to burnout. So from a more from a physiological perspective, I also want to talk about the connection with menopause. That's something that you and I have been talking about in past podcast episodes. And I think there really is a connection here that I'm curious about. Um, I also want to talk about, like, I want to bring this into what we're dealing with right now in our modern kind of world right now in this moment with this pandemic and what's happening with women. And I don't know about you, but I am seeing in my coaching practice, I'm seeing like quite a rapid incline in what seems to be burnout in women as a result of what's going on. So I want to talk about all that stuff. But why don't we start with how people get kind of the mechanism of how people get to burnout, what's going on there.
Yeah, I can do that. Do you want to cover just some of the symptoms first?
Go for
just
it.
So that, because I think that there are some unusual symptoms on here that people don't associate with burnout, that when I say, they show up on an intake form with fatigue and exhaustion, and then in a separate column is all these other things, which usually the person thinks are not related.
Sure.
But often they are.
Are some of these the things that we're going to see that people would see on Dr. Wilson's list if they go there? Is that what you're?
Yeah, some of them.
Perfect.
Yeah. So we can.
I will link that just for anyone listening. I'm going to link that. I should have said that. I'll put that in the show notes so that if you're curious and you want to go check it out yourself, I'll have the link to that in the show notes to this podcast episode.
Okay, great. So do you want me to just go through a few of the symptoms then?
Sure.
Yeah, so the things that most people know about already coming into my office are weight gain around the belly, low energy, though that makes sense, the irritability and intolerance, sort of impatience that comes with being fatigued all the time. But the ones that are not always associated in people's minds with this are an increase in allergies. So, people who are having a bad allergy season, yes, there can definitely be changes, difference in pollen in the air and environmental exposure. But people who have seen a ramp up in their allergies are often dealing with adrenal fatigue, chronic infections, unable to heal well from injuries, unable to heal well from wounds, like a cut that takes 6 weeks to heal instead of 3 weeks. Hair loss. So hair loss is a big topic around perimenopause, and it also can be adrenal fatigue related. A feeling of lightheadedness or dizziness, and especially when you're going from lying to standing. Poor digestion, irritable bowel symptoms, heart palpitations. And as I said before, that one really interesting piece for me is the sort of reluctant to participate in your life, that feeling like withdrawing and wanting to self-isolate. So those are some of the ones that stand out for me and are often not put in under the category of adrenal fatigue, and changes in periods. So even in women who are not in perimenopause and menopause, you can see changes in periods.
So yeah, I can see just from what I know from talking to you about perimenopause symptoms that there's some overlapping stuff there. It could get
a lot of overlap. Yeah.
Confusing for somebody. I can see how there'd be lots of room to kind of put yourself in one category when you're actually probably in another category. So,
or both.
Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. What's the allergy? I'm just curious. What's the allergy thing about? How do the adrenals connect with the allergy?
Well, a healthy allergic response in a body in what we call homeostasis. So a body where this sort of stress is not impacting it in a huge degree, or it's being managed, is kind of our histamine levels and our response to allergens are kind of kept in that balance if the rest of your body is in balance. But if you're then don't have enough resources, or your system's in hyper overdrive, then the reactivity is much greater.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so those are some of the weirder, stranger, more unique symptoms of burnout than the typical ones that we see. Like generally physical exhaustion, emotional exhaustion. Those are kind of the most common ones, and just this kind of general loss of joy that we see with it. Okay, that's helpful. So how do people get there? Like, what's happening in our bodies that we get to that stage where we start having some of those symptoms?
Well, it's rarely a short path to adrenal fatigue. When people come into my office, I ask them, what's the last decade been like? What's the last decade and a half been like? How have things been since university? What kind of person were you in university in terms of, or in your first beginning of your career in terms of how you manifested stress and how you dealt with stress? So I'm looking way back to see what sort of was the underpinnings of how your body started to get tired. And then usually there's some major life events in there, right? So we have our what we call normal life, and then we have some major events, right? So it could be childbirth, it could be career change, it could be buying a house, there's a whole chart of stress levels, or the most stressful things that you can go through as a human, and many of us go through one or more of those. um, and then you and then So I see a lot of women who have children. So raising children, not sleeping, perimenopause, not sleeping might start well before your hormones start to really show changes in terms of cycles. So you may have had sort of light sleep. A lot of women say, yeah, I haven't really slept well since my babies. And that in itself just starts to gradually wear away at the system. And the more tired you are, the more the next day you have to push yourself through that day. And the more you push yourself, the more exhausted your system gets. And so if you look at this chart called the General Adaptation Syndrome, or syndrome, I've got, yeah, General Adaptation Syndrome, this graph, it was the sort of the first graph, or the first recognition by his name was Hans Selye, and he was the first person to really talk about the stress response and what we call our adaptation to stress. And so you see in this chart, I think, Wendy, you're going to put it up or in the show notes.
Yeah, I can put doesn't seem to be any way for me to do that on iTunes or Spotify. But if you go to my blog, where the podcast is on my blog, if you're curious about that chart, I'll have it there on my blog under this podcast episode.
Okay, you can also just Google it, General Adaptation Syndrome. So what happens is that when you come across, so let's say you're having a sort of a non-stressful time, and then you come across an event that is stressful, or a thought that is stressful, your body goes into alarm, and your system, your resistance to stress decreases during that time, and your body goes into fight or flight.
Mm-hmm.
And then from that fight or flight, then if you complete the stress cycle, which we'll talk about at some point, then you can restore that balance. But as humans, we tend not to complete that stress cycle. And so we continue up and we collect stressors. So every single stressor, maybe the first stressor is gone, and now the second stressor has come along, or a 14th or a 15th of your morning. And then you're collecting it. And as you collect those stressors and your body continues to go into these fight or flight moments, then your body starts to produce a lot of cortisol. And the cortisol keeps you high in an adaptive mode. And so you'll see on the graph, it dips down into the stress response, the initial stress response, this fight or flight, and then it goes up into a sort of adaptive state where you end up staying. And you can stay in this adaptive state for quite a long time. I mean, the body's an amazing thing. It's adapting to save your life, basically. It's adapting so that you don't, so that each stressor does not kill you, basically. And so you get into this adaptive state, but this adaptive state is a high cortisol state, which is wearing your system down. It's basically emptying your gas tank every single day. And then eventually that curve starts to drop again, and you go into exhaustion. And
Right.
so that is kind of basically what human beings are doing every single day, every moment of the day, because there's very few of us that are actually completing stress cycles and able to go back to the homeostatic, or the balance, that is where the body is actually able to perform all of its long-term survival activities, right?
Yeah.
And some of the examples I use in my practice are like, if you're a gazelle and you're being chased by a lion. So let's say you're the gazelle and you're eating grass or whatever it is that you eat on the savannah, and and then you perceive a lion out of the corner of your eye, and you take off. You're running. I don't think many gazelles are fighting the lions, so they're fleeing. You take off, and let's say you're much faster than the lion, and you get away from the lion. As a gazelle, then you go back to eating grass, and your whole nervous system calms down. The lion is gone, and you complete your stress cycle. You go back to your homeostatic life, right? As humans, we have
Don't do
we
that.
just yeah, we don't do that. We just accumulate lions,
Yeah.
and then we turn other things into lions, right? So very few of us have actual predators in our lives. I can turn the fact that I haven't checked the groceries off my list for the weekend into a predator if I want to. I can filter that through my fight or flight mechanism and make the fact that I haven't gotten to a chance to do the groceries a life stressor, like a sort of fight or flight, life and death event. And if my body is used to being in that state, if it's primed for that because I haven't been completing stress cycles, I've just been accumulating stressors and having these adrenaline spikes and cortisol spikes like 50 times a morning, then I'm just going to hang that. I'm going to put that energy, anything that I do, I'm going to put that energy into it. And so the people that come to me that are what we call tired but wired, that's the sort of the classic adrenal fatigue, general adaptation at the top of the resistance phase. The next group of people that come are the ones who've gone through that and they're too tired to be wired, right? They're on the other side of that.
And I think one thing that I want to go back to that you just said that I think is fascinating, and I think it's really important for people to understand. And just so everybody knows, this podcast is on burnout and adrenal fatigue. Sarah and I are going to be recording another podcast right after this one that you won't hear. You won't hear as part of this episode, but you will hear as a future episode where we're going to talk about closing the stress cycle. We're going to talk about cortisol. We're going to talk about how we can do that better as women and what a massive impact that can have in terms of our ability to actually manage our own cortisol. And the power that we have there. So what I wanted to do though was go back to that kind of that gazelle eating the grass example and your grocery list example, because what's happening in the grocery list example is that even if you get the bloody groceries, so even if at some point during the weekend you go get the groceries, and so you can technically check it off your list, your body physiologically doesn't recognize checking something off a list as like the stress
completing
the stress cycle, right? So because we're mammals, just like all the other mammals out there, like that gazelle, our systems are designed the same way. And we're designed to either choose fight or flight, or in some rare occasions, freeze, which is the third one we don't talk about that much, but we're designed to do that. And so our bodies recognize flight and fighting in a really physical way. Like that's a physical cue, right? Just like the gazelle, when it starts eating grass again, that's a cue, like a physical cue to its body. Okay, everything's okay. There's time to eat grass. Obviously the danger has passed. But checking something off on a piece of paper doesn't do that for our bodies. And so we don't close the stress cycle even when the stressor has passed. And I find that really fascinating. And I think I'm really looking forward to talking about that, because you and I both have lots of strategies that we recommend and teach your patients, my clients, around how to actually close that stress cycle. So there is hope here, guys. I don't want to leave you feeling like I'm that person. I'm always stressed about everything. There are lots of strategies that you can use, both physical strategies and emotional and mental strategies that you can use, and practices that you can put in place in your life that can really help to close that stress cycle way more often. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to come back to that. So that is the GAS syndrome / cycle. And is it a coincidence it's called GAS?
I know.
acronym is GAS.
I know. I noticed that as I was making some notes. I was like, oh, that's interesting. How can I work that in? Just back. So that's the mechanism of what's happening. And we did kind of talk about causes. I did want to just go back to one thing about in terms of causation that I just want to highlight this. I'm not a sports physiologist, but I can tell you that women who are overtraining
Yeah.
end up adrenally fatigued.
Yeah.
And this is something that is contrary to what the world is telling them, right? And so that's a really important piece, is that back to sort of causation. There's lots of causes,
Yeah.
but people with chronic pain, chronic diseases, all of those things, they grind on your nervous system over time,
Yeah.
and it causes an exhaustion. It doesn't have to be like, a lot of people will say to me, but I haven't had major stressors.
Yeah.
Right. And so it doesn't feel to them like it fits in what we think of as burnout. But when you start to dig and you start to look at their expenditure of energy and how their bodies expend energy, then often you find the clues, right? And it also, sometimes we've adapted so well. Some women have adapted so well that they don't think they're stressed. They
Oh,
don't
yeah.
think at
Oh,
all.
do you hear this I hear this all the
Yeah.
time. I'm really good at dealing with stress. Like, I cope exceptionally well.
Oh,
And
I hear that all the time.
it's
Yeah.
because they haven't gotten to the exhaustions. I'm
Right.
back to this GAS model. I think that
Oh.
that what's happening in that situation is they're just in that resistance phase,
Yeah.
or whatever. They're up there. Their body is like keeping them going, because again, the body's an amazing machine, and we can keep that up for a really, really long time. But then at some point, we can't do it any longer. And so when women come to me and say that, I'm always like, sort of tongue in cheek, saying something to them like, so you think you're special? Like, do you have some kind of special superhuman thing going on here that's going to prevent you from burning out like everybody else? Because, and I do that, I do say that in a kind of a tongue-in-cheek way, because that was me. I mean, that's who I thought I was when I was practicing law, and I had the 2 babies, and I was like a partner in this law firm, and I was just doing it in, I'm putting this in air quotes, doing it all. But really, I wasn't doing it all.
Yeah.
I was, my body was like helping me get through that as best it could, but I could only do that for so long, just like every woman can only do that for so long. At some point, that catches up to us. So I think that that's really important. And when you're talking about overtraining, that's something else that I see in my practice fairly often. I always remind people of the fact that stress comes in 3 forms. Like, there's mental stress, there's emotional stress, and there's physical stress. And physical stress has exactly the same, causes the same response in our body. It causes us to go into fight or flight. And physical stress can look like sleep deprivation. It can look like over exercising. It can look like illness. Yeah. So when you're talking about chronic fatigue, all of those things cause the same reaction in our body, because our body perceives that as stress and goes into fight or flight, and our cortisol goes up. So, while exercise can be a helpful way to close the stress cycle, which we'll talk about in our subsequent podcast in terms of ways to manage this, it also can be a form of stress itself. It can contribute to the problem.
As can calorie deprivation and not managing blood sugar.
Right.
So, every time that your body goes into more hunger than it can handle, you may not feel that because you're already jacked up. But the body's saying, this is an emergency, so it's dumping cortisol into the system in order to dump stored sugar from the liver into the body, so that your brain has enough glucose so that it can actually function. So you may not feel any of that going on, but it's just another alarm mechanism, right? So it's another situation where your body's being physically stressed.
Yeah. And that's like, when I'm just kind of doing a nutshell sort of explanation for people, and we will go into this in more detail in the next podcast. I knew this was going to happen. I knew we were going to have trouble keeping these 2 things separated. What can you do? You get to pay for, guys. It's a free podcast. No, when I'm talking about stress and cortisol, I always say there are 3 big ways that we create cortisol. One is through stress, like obvious stress that we actually identify as stress. But we also create excess cortisol when we have terrible sleep patterns, because our body recognizes that as a form of stress. And when we eat poorly, when we don't eat frequently, we don't treat our body with the care that it needs, we're skipping meals too often, and we're also eating a diet that's too high in refined carbohydrates and sugars, and too low in, the good stuff that we need more of, like fiber and protein and fat. And what ends up happening is that creates the same, if essentially all 3 of those situations are signaling to our body, Houston, we have a problem, things aren't good. And our body is just trying, it's reacting to that, and it's just trying to do whatever it can to protect us. And our body's protection, self-defense mechanism is fight or flight in that situation. So the good news is some of those things are within our control, Sarah. So the one thing and this is why I love food, and it's one of my main pillars of wellness when I'm coaching, is because food is almost always something that you can change.
So I just wanted to go back to the women who talk about handling stress well or not feeling stressed, that they're kind of able to manage, or that they're not. Sometimes I hear, I'm not particularly tired, I just keep going. I might be tired, but I just keep going. I will often, that's my first clue to check out how much caffeine they're drinking, because that's often what is actually fueling their being okay in their minds, is that I can get through my day because I'm having 2 cups of coffee in the morning, and then I'm eating chocolate at 3 o'clock. That's that would be a pretty typical picture. And so I challenge them to go off caffeine. As you know, I'm sort of like, that's one of my things, but I also challenge them with the question, so first of all, if you didn't have caffeine, how tired would you be? So we have to get underneath all the stimulants. And if someone gave you permission to do nothing for a week, what would you do? And the typical answer is, oh my God, I would sleep for a week. Right?
Right. That's interesting. Yeah.
So, but it's about having that permission. Like if you could just sort of cryogenically freeze your life, and then you could have no guilt, nothing. Everybody's just in place, and you go off and sit on the couch for a few minutes and contemplate what it is that you need to do. Most women would, say, oh, I would do nothing but read and sleep. I'm like, well, that's the answer. That's what you need.
Right.
Right. So how can we find that? How can we find that in your life?
Yeah.
So, but a lot of women are not, busyness is a badge. It's a badge in our society. And I used to love the quote from Christian Northrup that the only socially acceptable way to rest is to get sick.
Yeah, that's such a great one. I know. And I talk about that a lot too, that idea of like busyness being a badge of honor. And there's a great Brene Brown quote on this one too. I can't remember it offhand, but it's awesome. I've shared it before. That idea that we see this as something to brag about, and and we're in this like comparison-based society, and social media is not helping with this. You and I have had our own conversations about social media and how that's impacting women's burnout rates and stress. But what's happening is we're constantly feeling like we need to keep up with the next person. And if we as a society call this a good thing, then women are going to keep doing it. And if we don't make this connection between busyness and like burnout and physical, not just physical symptoms, mental health symptoms, all the really terrible stuff that can come with burnout when it progresses. And you and I have both seen that. If we don't start making that connection, burnout rates are just going to keep on going up. They're just going to go up and up and up and up. And I used to do this, so I own this fully. When I practiced law, I billed by the 5-minute increment. Like I was the poster child for busyness, right? My value was based on how many 0.1s I billed over the course of a 24-hour day.
Right.
And so I just get into this mindset of like, I always have to be doing. Again, I'm just going to say this one more time on this podcast. My favorite quote is from Bertrand Russell. Time you enjoy wasting is not wasted time. It's actually burnout prevention. That's what it is, right?
Completely. Yeah.
Put a value on it. Start putting a value on the time where you just chill out. Anyway, okay, we went on a tangent, sidetrack there. Can we talk about how it coincides with perimenopause and menopause? Like because as we said, there's some overlapping symptoms there, it seems to me. And how do we what's the timing where we most often see burnout in women's lives? Like, is there kind of a period of time where we tend to see it more often? And how does that coincide with the hormonal shifts that are happening?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think it happens mostly in women sort of 40 and up. That would be my guess. I don't see that many women who are terribly burnt out in their 30s. And if they are, I think usually they've had some really significant life events that have contributed to that.
Yeah, that'd be my experience too, for sure. Yeah.
And also the 30-year-olds bounce back quicker. So I think it's like a perfect storm of, age, uh, place in your career. So having worked super hard to get to a certain place in the career, and it's all kind of coming together around mid 40s maybe. This is for a particular kind of careers, but yeah, so careers, children, um, life events, right? So the older you are, the more chances are that you're going to have experienced caregiving, a sick individual in your life, older parents, stressors around siblings, that kind of thing.
Grief.
um, Grief, things like, you've maybe done some major things like moved your house, moved your whole family. So it's kind of an accumulation of a lot of things. Maybe you've done a master's degree or a PhD. You've gone on to do more schooling while you've also been working and had children. So these are kind of the, and then all of a sudden you're also perimenopausal. So mid 40s, you're kind of right there. Your body's aging, and then you have this transition into menopause. So what we want from the adrenals at perimenopause is we want the adrenals to be supporting the hormone shift from the ovaries, so that you don't kind of just drop into perimenopause or into menopause, so that it's like so it's like less steep slope, if you will. And we want the adrenals to produce hormones in order to do that. But if your adrenals are not empty, but if your adrenals gas tank, let's say if your gas tank is empty and their priority at this stage is actually just keeping you alive, then and managing your stress, then your body's interest in reproductive hormones at 45 is very little. So it's just it prioritizes managing your stress level over producing reproductive hormones. And we saw that when I was talking in the other podcast about that pregnenolone steal, where the body does not really focus on progesterone. It will go straight to cortisol. And so then we see this kind of decline in progesterone from mid 40s on, which then impacts your ability to manage the fluctuating estrogen that happens in those perimenopausal years going towards menopause. So it really is a perfect storm. The best possible thing you can do going into perimenopause is have healthy adrenals, as far as I'm concerned.
So fascinating
right?
to me. I'm going to just say this now. We're going to, at some point, Sarah and I are going to talk about me. Because I've just had some hormone tests done that have come back and given me some information about where I am in terms of my hormonal stage, but also in relation to my stress hormones and what's going on there. So I think that we're going to have a really interesting conversation on this, because as you were just saying that, if you're not watching the video version of this podcast, I just pointed at myself when Sarah said, was talking about this idea of, if you're going into perimenopause or menopause, those menopausal years with, adrenals that have taken a hit for the last however many years, that can make that transition. It sounds like a much more extreme and drastic transition than it might be if your body was not constantly trying to steal the pregnenolone in order to make cortisol just to keep you alive, and could actually focus on on supporting your reproductive hormones better.
Yeah. The other piece of that is that some research I came across last night was that there are some studies that suggest that cortisol actually naturally increases at menopause, and there's not a whole lot of understanding why and its relationship, but there's a relationship to estrogen, and this is something I need to explore a little bit more, because I was excited to find that information. But there is a link between higher levels of cortisol and more severe vasomotor symptoms. So that would be your hot flashes and your night sweats.
Right.
And so, if you're coming into perimenopause and your cortisol's high and you're living in that tired but wired state, and you're having trouble coming out of that, then that cortisol plus your body's natural increase in cortisol around menopause is also going to make your hot flashes and night sweats worse.
This is so fascinating. Again, do not despair if you're listening to this podcast and you're like me and you're having a lot of these symptoms and you're getting frustrated with your inability to manage them. We're going to talk about that in a subsequent podcast, which we're recording right after this one. So we promise you it's coming. But that's really fascinating to me, that connection. Thanks for explaining that. I think the last thing that I really want to talk about in this episode is something that I've been seeing in my practice, and I know you've been seeing it in your practice over the course of COVID. We've both been working through this pandemic. My practice has actually picked up. I'm one of the lucky people for whom I'm busier. And I think a piece of that, unfortunately, is related to the fact that women are now doing even more than they were doing before. So now we are, and I'm not slagging the men are doing a lot too, but women are not only now doing the first and second shift that we have typically traditionally always done. So for those of us who work and are also taking care of other people, we're doing the caregiving shift and we're also doing the work shift. But now we're also doing a third shift where many of us are trying to manage homeschooling and all the other, stuff that is the gong show that is this pandemic right now. And that, of course, can only be elevating cortisol.
Yeah. So, the latest statistic that I read is that women, mothers, are doing 20 hours more a week of work with their children being home, or managing remote learning, and also simply caregiving the rest of the family. Right. So the caregiving, making sure that the older people in the family are looked after, making sure that everybody has the resources that they need. And so the baseline anxiety in society has gone up. Right. And the fact of the matter is that those lions aren't going anywhere. Right. So we've all adapted as part of this general adaptation syndrome. We've all raised our tolerance of anxiety, of the anxiety of the pandemic. I mean, compared to the first 6 weeks when we were locked down, I feel different now about it than I did then. Then I was in that alarm mode all the time. Now it's just, okay, now we're just living with this. That's the adaptation piece. But it's adding another layer of chronic adaptation, if you will, to the picture. And so we've got not only that, but we also have just, barely lived through this election in the US, which, I'm not American, but it has an impact on my world. Obviously, it has an impact on the entire planet. There's just, and then people worrying about the flu. Are we going to get shut down? The uncertainty. And, we're lucky living where we are right now because we're still all out and functioning in the world. We're not locked down, but all over the world, there are women who are back in this third shift. And, having to deal with the uncertainty of schedules, whether I can get out, whether I can find any time for self-care, are the kids going to school today or are they not? All of this uncertainty creates a level of anxiety that it's much, much more heightened. So it's just making this whole thing worse, and it's just depleting women even more. So it's going to take the exhaustion, the falling off the cliff into the exhaustion piece is going to happen sooner. I think for women having gone through this major stress, because this is sustained stress. This isn't just one event. This is like massively sustained stress, and we're all coping pretty well with it, but that coping isn't allowing us to complete that stress cycle, right? Because it's perpetually there. The new normal, right? The new normal is actually the new normal of higher levels of stress.
Right. I think that the really important thing in what you just said, I think, if I've got this right, this is sort of how I would explain it, is that coping does not equal no problem.
Yeah.
Coping
totally.
does not equal like no damage,
That's right.
Nothing to worry about. Just because you're coping because your body is designed for you to cope. Like that's what our bodies do. Our bodies help us to cope. That whole we're going to talk about in our next podcast, that whole fight or flight is designed to put us in a position to be as equipped as possible to deal with the lion.
Yeah.
So we are designed to cope, but just because we're coping doesn't mean like, that's almost like you're just looking at the surface and you're not looking at anything that's happening underneath. And I think that's what you and I really wanted to stress, pun intended, in this podcast. We wanted to really make sure that it was clear to people that, just because you're coping, it doesn't mean that you should like not think about this or worry, or
Right.
we can, and it's not that we want people to worry more. We want to do the opposite. We want people to become aware. We want to increase awareness around this for women so that women start thinking about this and start getting really proactive in terms of what they're doing daily, in terms of their habits, mental habits, physical habits, emotional habits, all of that stuff, what they're doing to manage what's going down on underneath. It's like, an ocean, or, where you just, everything's nice on the top, but underneath the water is churning. There's like a riptide going on under there, right?
Yeah. The thing is, as women, we've been taught that not coping is not acceptable, right? Like, it's weakness. If you don't cope, you're not, if you're not coping, then you're weak, and it's certainly not sexy, right? It's not sexy not to cope, right? So I've certainly been given the message my entire life that, from society, from my family, from various sources, that if I actually let my true, fully, like, vulnerable emotions show, as Brene Brown talks about this all the time. It's like the perceived feeling of weakness or failure. It totally keeps you from doing that. But what that's doing is it's keeping everybody in this coped up state all the time, and also most of the time not even recognizing how coped up we are, and that being coped up is a great armor. It's a great tool to get you through the stressful times, but it is not sustainable for the long period.
Well, yeah. And the irony in that, of course, is that if you don't feel the emotion, if you don't feel comfortable feeling the emotion, if it feels like it's not socially acceptable to actually like say what you need to say, feel what you need to feel, you get stuck in that. You get stuck in coping for longer. You get stuck in the stress cycle. You never close that stress cycle part. And we're going to talk about this again in the next podcast. But part of closing the stress cycle is actually feeling the emotion. If you don't feel the emotion and allow your body to process it, whatever that looks like for you, it might be having a really great cry. I mean, there's a reason why we feel so good after we have a good weep. We
totally
feel great afterwards because we actually let it out. And that's such an important piece of actually managing stress effectively. We haven't talked about this new book, but I'm just going to mention it now. We'll probably talk about it again in the second half of the podcast. I know that you listened to the Brene Brown podcast, I think, where these two sisters, the Nagoski sisters, were interviewed by Brene Brown about their new book, which is called Burnout: The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle. It's such a great book. It's really great because it talks about all the stuff we're talking about. It gives it a different take on it, which I think is always great to learn things from different angles and different perspectives. It helps our brains to process it and store it, and for us to actually act on it. So I really recommend this book. But it's also focused on women. And it's focused on women's stress. And the truth is, a lot of the burnout stress, if we're talking about more of the, where we started with the World Health Organization's definition of burnout, we're talking about occupational burnout. A lot of that is focused on men. And this book really talks about what you and I are talking about, which is really the collective stress that busy women find themselves under all the time. And how that is not just workplace stress for us. We have these other tiers of stress that we're constantly grappling with. And now, as we've said, on top of that, we have the stress of this pandemic and what's going on with that. So this is such a timely topic. Thank you very much for joining me today to give your explanation of it to us. It's been super enlightening for me, and I know for everybody listening, it's been really helpful. We will be back with the next podcast. And in the next podcast, we're going to be talking specifically about the stress cycle. We're going to talk about cortisol as a hormone. We're going to talk about all of between Sarah and I, our collective kind of toolkit of things that women can be doing. And I promise you, we're going to only make practical suggestions. We're not going to give you crazy suggestions that feel completely out of reach for you. We're going to really try to focus on things that you can do now that are practical, that are doable, that will fit in your real life, and that will actually make an impact for you when it comes to managing stress and hopefully preventing ever getting to a place of burnout. And that was a monologue. Thanks, Sarah. Okay, everybody, we're gonna end this podcast now, and we'll be back with subsequent episodes soon. Thanks for listening.
See ya.
You've been listening to Bite Size Balance with your host, Wendy McCallum. As a burnout and balance coach, I help busy high achievers like you create a more balanced, joyful life. To be sure you don't miss any upcoming Bite Size conversations, subscribe now to this podcast. For more balance and wellness tips or to connect with me, visit my website at wendymccallum.com. That's WENDYMCCALLUM.com.